Hi there, welcome to the stream. So in today's stream, I'm going to be talking a little bit about what's gone on, the local elections, and I'm also going to be chatting with you. Please do put comments in the chat because it's going to keep me going. There's probably not going to be many of you watching today, but this is a bit of an experiment really, so I hope you will join me for a little while and we can have a little bit of a chat about the local elections. So the first thing I want to do is just go through the results really. So let me just get those on the screen for you. Okay, we just need to go to the BBC homepage and have a little look at the disaster that has unfolded over the last 24 hours. So what we can see is Reform massively surging really across the board, Labour having a really bad day, Conservatives having a really bad day, because remember, the last time these seats were for grabs was 2021, and this is Conservative territory anyway, so Johnson was in power. Labour had had their wobble over the Hartlepool by-election. So the Conservatives did pretty well last time these seats were contested. And since then, we had obviously the catastrophe of Boris Johnson's time in power, Liz Truss's time in power, and Labour winning a general election. So that's where we are. And lots of people in the media have been saying that they're really shocked by what's been going on. And it's jarring, I would say, right? I don't know, it feels like we've entered a new era of politics, perhaps, that we've had some things confirmed that perhaps we weren't entirely certain of. But if we just look at the polls, um, it's actually been pretty clear since the election what has gone on. The story has been that the Labour Party started actually on quite a low percentage of the vote following the general election. They were on 33.5% of the vote, and they've really declined ever since. Whereas Reform have been benefiting from that, and actually the Tories have been staying roughly the same. They've declined slightly. It's telling me that the stream's not working. I hope it is. If you are here, let me know. In fact, let me just have a little check. How do I even do that? YouTube health is excellent, lovely. So it was a bit upset for a second there. So hopefully you can hear me. Yeah, let's return to what I was saying. Yeah, so Labour since the election in sharp decline. Um, and look, let's just tell the narrative of what's been going on here. I think one of the things that a lot of people get wrong is they think that just because Labour won a landslide that they must have been really popular at the time of the election in 2024. But actually, the result in 2024 was that the Labour Party got 33.7% of the vote, which is the smallest percentage of the vote that's ever resulted in a majority for the winning party. It's worse than Blair in 2005. And so they were never really, oh, great, I can see a comment. It's working, fantastic. So they were never really that popular to begin with. And so it's really important to understand that, because I think that the narrative that Starmer himself might even believe, and that the Labour right certainly believe, is that because they won this massive landslide, that meant that they had this huge mandate for what they call change, and that's why they're pressing ahead with that. But actually, the reality was that at the last election in 2024, Labour were benefiting from Tory collapse much more than they were benefiting from their own popularity. And so it really was quite a weak victory for Labour in 2024 in a really weird way. And it feels strange to say that when it's a landslide, but it is true. And the other thing that was the case in 2024 is that Labour's vote was because of how they had to win. The Tories collapsed. They were winning seats, Labour, but they were winning them, only very narrowly. So a lot of the seats they did win became a lot more marginal. They actually lost ground in some of their strongest areas. So they were starting from a very very low base. And then they declined. So why did they decline? Well, look, we've lived through this, haven't we? They made some incredibly unpopular policy decisions. They really upset the elderly. They attacked the disabled, and the political narrative that has accompanied those moves has not been very clear. It's okay as a politician to make unpopular decisions, But what you need to have is a narrative. So if you go back, let's just consider some examples, right? So if you go back to what I thought was a really unpopular policy, 2010, the Tories come to power promising austerity, but they provide a narrative, right? They say we have to do this because we have to get the public finances under check, and so they give a sense of where they're heading, right? It wasn't my chosen policy choice. Maybe some of you in the chat agreed with that. I don't know. But they gave a sense of where they were heading. Whereas with Labour at the moment, it just feels like what you get as a political narrative is empty sound bites, instead of a clear narrative. So there isn't a narrative from Labour. In fact, I would say there isn't really a political strategy at all to speak of. They don't seem to know what they're about. I don't think Starmer ever has seemed to know what he was about. And even today, you get this idea that what's the language they've been using? They've been saying we're going to go further and faster. Now that is, first of all, it's very vague, and there's repetition of this idea of change. But secondly, if you're this unpopular with what you've already done, telling people that you're going to go further and faster is not a terribly good political strategy, because obviously people are not very happy with what you've done. If we look at Starmer's approval ratings as a prime minister, his approval ratings are through the floor. It's actually pretty unprecedented, this, right? This is why I'm putting this graph on the screen. People mention the polling in 1983, right? So let's take a look at 83. So this is the polling between 1979 and 1983, right? You can see there's a decline for Margaret Thatcher, but it's nowhere near as steep. Thatcher was implementing some really difficult policies, trying to bring down inflation by hiking up interest rates and making cuts to spending. Nowhere near, right? So there isn't really a precedent for a party coming to power, winning an election, and falling off a cliff this fast, right? So we are in uncharted territory, and yeah, as I said, Starmer does not have a political base in the country. He's alienated people like me. The pollsters like to call us progressive activists. I just like to say the left, right? He's alienated the left in politics. There's absolutely no way I would vote for Keir Starmer or the Labour Party at the moment, for a whole variety of reasons. But they also didn't have the depth of support amongst the voters that they won over from the Conservative Party. So they're losing votes now from the left and from the right, and it's really difficult to see how Labour recover from this. The story of the Tories is just obvious, right? Nothing's changed. They had two crap prime ministers. Johnson made, obviously massive errors in relation to lockdown parties, and more importantly, lying about it. And then, of course, we had the Liz Truss mini budget, which wrecked the Conservative Party's economic credibility, and they just haven't recovered. And Kemi Badenoch is she seems weak to me. She doesn't seem to know what she's doing. And then you have reform, right? So why are people turning to reform? Well, put what you think in the chat, and then I can respond to it. But it seems to me pretty obvious that they're fed up of mainstream politicians. They're fed up of politicians who don't seem to answer questions. They're fed up of politicians who spin the answer to what they're trying to say. They're fed up of politicians that don't seem to have clarity about what they want to deliver from the country. And they're fed up of politicians promising change and then not delivering it. And again, if we think about Keir Starmer's journey as a Labour leader, when he was making his argument to become a Labour leader, I actually voted for him. I've said that before on here. He promised these 10 pledges that were very Corbynite in nature. So a lot of people like me felt like they could get on board with that. And the problem is, if that's where you start, people will notice when that isn't what you deliver, and when actually you then go into an election promising something completely different or promising very little to people. So there's this idea around Starmer that he's a liar, that you can't really trust him. Um, and I think the reality is actually pretty close to that. I mean, I think Starmer is a man that doesn't believe anything. Yeah, exactly, Mr. Kind Stranger. Yeah. He also lacks charisma, but that's not the most important element, I don't think. I mean, you could make the comparison between Starmer and Blair, right? That Blair had charisma and was able to project a sense of what he was about. But the key thing about Blair that Starmer seems woefully incapable of doing is that Blair would make an argument about what he was doing. You might not always have agreed with Blair. Obviously, many people on the left disagreed over Iraq, for example, and then eventually the rest of the country. Um, but he made an argument. He gave you a vision of what he was trying to achieve. And politicians have to do that. You cannot continue to sustain yourself in office by just saying, oh, there are difficult decisions to make and not explaining why you're making them. You just blame the other guys and then just talking nebulously about change. Um, so I actually find it, I don't know what everybody else feels like, but I actually find it like deeply frustrating to live through because um, there are some obvious things that Starmer could do to turn things around, but I'm not sure whether he has the political skill to do it. Yeah, absolutely, Daniel. Yeah. So, and people are turning to the right, right? So why are they doing that? I don't think it's necessarily because the British public have suddenly become really right wing. I think it's because Nigel Farage is the only politician in the country that is giving people a clear sense of direction, and that feels different. Um, People often say there's some good analysis from Steve Richards along these lines that winning elections is about capturing the narrative of change. And what Farage is able to do in the current circumstances is capture that narrative and say, actually, the Labour Party are not the party of change. We are. And what you'll get from reform is, real, honest politics. Um, and there's other stuff going on. There's blaming migrants, which again comes back to this idea of political narrative. I mean, that's not the problem with the country. And I could talk a little bit about Mr. Farage in a second, but I want to do a bit of analysis before I launch into that. Um, do you think if I don't know who those people are? Oh, Ben Habib. Yeah, yeah, yeah. If he creates some party, no, I don't, because Farage has been uniquely successful in every party he's run. Um, so I actually think if Farage disappeared tomorrow, the polling would go all over the place in a very unpredictable manner because I don't think there's another politician in the country that's quite got Farage's level of skill. Um, Possibly Boris Johnson on the right, possibly Andy Burnham, something like that on the left. And I might talk a little bit more about Burnham in a second as well. The other thing I'd say is if we actually analyse who Farage is and what reform are about, they will inevitably disappoint as well. I mean, I think that they will win the next election. That is my view now. And I think that because that is what the polling is telling us. And if my analysis so far is correct, if Labour do not move in terms of what they're going to be putting forward, I think that the Labour Party are not going to be able to recover. It's really difficult to see how you go from Starmerism to a political strategy that gets you out of this. Um, and that leads me to the obvious conclusion, by the way, that Starmer needs to go if Labour are going to win the next election. And I hope Labour MPs get to that conclusion rather quickly. And that they also get to the conclusion that the person that needs to replace them is somebody like Andy Burnham. So I think Starmer needs to go if Labour have got any chance. But if things continue, Farage becomes the next prime minister. But then you get back to the same cycle again, I think, because Nigel Farage talks a lot about change, but Nigel Farage is a neoliberal. He believes in Thatcherism. He believes in mainstream neoliberal economics. So, he's essentially putting forward Thatcherism on steroids with a little bit of um, anti-immigrant bashing. Although Mrs. Thatcher wasn't disinclined to do that herself. So what you're going to get is a low tax, small state, free market approach with a little bit of populism bolted on from Farage. I mean, he's a little bit smarter than that, and he's a little bit more nuanced than that. You heard him, for example, come out in favor of nationalisation recently when he thought it would be popular. Um, but Farage, if you think about it in class terms, right? What sort of voter does Nigel Farage stand up for? It is the rich, because that is the class Nigel Farage comes from. He's a banker. He's in terms of his past, and it was actually Margaret Thatcher. I think it was entering the ERM. He said that got him involved in politics initially, or it was something like that. Like it was something. It was something like that. It's in my Nigel Farage video if you want to check what it was. Okay, let's have a look at some of these. Do put some questions in the chat. Yeah, deficit tax cuts are not something I'm in favour of, right? Because this is the mistake that Liz Truss made with the mini budget. The problem with the deficit tax cut is it's too hypothetical. So if you cut corporation tax, for example, the theory from the right is that if you cut taxes, it's going to encourage investment, but that's hypothetical. And it requires a change in behaviour. And so there might be some change in behavior at the margin. So let's say, I don't know, 20% more people invest in the UK. That's quite an inefficient way of encouraging that behavior, and it's also far too speculative. So that's why the markets don't like it, because it's not sort of guaranteed to happen. Oh, you're having a laugh. Oh, well, I'll continue with my analysis anyway. And whereas if you directly invest, which is what I would encourage the Labour Party to do, the first thing I would do if I was Starmer is reverse the unpopular stuff and nationalise water immediately. Just do something bold that people are actually going to say, "Oh wow, they're doing something," um, because he needs to be a bit desperate at this point in time. And also, um, the only argument I've heard against doing it is that it would cost too much money, and nationalisation doesn't cost too much money because there's a liability, but there's also an asset that you're buying, so they balance in terms of the national accounts. So there isn't really a good argument not to do it. Oh God, Carney. No, I don't think Carney. Um, Carney's going to massively disappoint in Canada. He, yeah, he's a banker. He's not a politician. You know, he's another guy that looks good in a suit. Um, that yes, he's done very well. He's come along at the right time when Canada was being attacked by Donald Trump. He's presented the right message to the Canadian people, but he needs to he needs to present a popular platform. So I'm a bit skeptical of Carney, and I think his popularity may well not last that long. But I don't know very much about Canadian politics. It's just a little bit of an instinct, and also it's not about. Blair didn't win in 1997 because he was particularly popular or he was particularly charismatic. He won because the social and historical circumstances were such that Labour were going to win that election. And then, of course, he does slightly better than any other Labour leader would have because he's got the charisma and he's got the way of presenting. Labour won in 1997 because Black Wednesday trashed the Conservative Party's economic credibility, and the Conservative Party became split and engulfed in crisis. And John Major's leadership was weak, lots of different reasons. And then, of course, Blair came along at the right time following the death of John Smith in 1994. But had John Smith lived, John Smith would have won the 1997 election. So I don't really buy that politics is about personality, but of course you've got to be able to seize that historical moment in the right way, and also sustain that support in office, which is something that the Starmer's not capable of. I've lost that comment. Burnham is overrated. Um, yeah. What? Okay. So why do I like Burnham? I like Burnham because what Labour needs to do to win a sustainable electoral coalition of voters that are going to be able to both sustain them in office and win elections is that they need to represent a broad spectrum of opinion in the country. So that means you need somebody who's going to be capable of appealing to the left, and also somebody that's going to be able to reach out beyond that, right? To create an electoral coalition that's going to be sustainable. And I think Burnham can do that. Um, he's got the right political instincts to do that. He's got a capacity to sort of put forward an argument, and I think politically, Labour need to move to the left somewhat, to occupy the territory, and to be populist, and to make some meaningful changes in the country. Just reading through the comments. Yeah, first past the post of the next election will be a bit of a lottery. But essentially, if you think about it, let me just go full screen because I've been on the screen for ages, haven't I? If you think about it, the what the polls are telling us is that Labour and the Conservatives are not popular, and they're declining in popularity. So at the next election, whichever party can get just a little bit above that, so something like what Farage is on at the moment. So the Reform Party are on what, about 26, 27% in the polls. That will do it, because that's what first past the post delivers. If you can manage to be the best party nationally, once you spread that out across the country, if other parties aren't able to match that level of support, you're going to be winning seats where the vote is split 3 or 4 ways. And so, that's why it's such an unsatisfactory voting system, because in circumstances like this, it can produce overwhelming majorities for the winning party, even though they're not that popular. It's exactly what happened last election. Keir Starmer's Labour Party, as I said at the beginning of the stream, they only had 33.7% of the vote, and they won a huge majority, not because they were particularly popular, but because that's what the electoral system delivered. Um, Birmingham next year, is that a local council election? Are they up next year, Birmingham? I don't know. I'm pretty nerdy about politics, but I don't know which councils are going to be going to the polls in which years. Um, yeah, the Greens need to. Yeah, the Green Party is a really interesting one. I don't. I'm not going to talk about the Lib Dems too much, although I will say Ed Davey actually. I think he's a better leader than many people imagine, because he does at least project a sense of authenticity. Um, I mean, I think the silly stunts need to go, but you do, at least from Ed Davey, get a sense that he cares about a particular issue, carers, because obviously he's got a disabled child, and I think that plays very well, and it comes across very well to the sorts of voters that Lib Dems need to appeal to. They're also positioned quite well just in general, because liberalism as an ideology can appeal to quite a broad section of society. So that always helps the Lib Dems. They can kind of lean into more classical liberalism or whatever in the Tory seats, and they can lean into more modern liberalism to appeal in Labour seats. So I think the Lib Dems are quite crafty in that way, and able to appeal to a broad set of voters. The problem with the Greens, I mean, I'm a member of the Green Party, but I'm highly critical of them. The first problem is they've got two leaders, and that is a crazy, self-indulgent idea. There needs to be one leader, and it needs to be somebody good. And I don't rate either of the two co-leaders. I think Carla Denyer is slightly better than Adrian Ramsey. I'm struggling to remember his name, um, but and why do I think that? I mean, I think Carla Denyer comes across as um, somebody that is trying to be head girl at a school. You know, she's very prim and proper. She comes across as very middle class. There's nothing particularly gritty about her. And what our the politicians that are doing well, people like Farage, are what do they have? They have authenticity. They've got a bit of grit. There's a sense that you're an ordinary guy. Johnson had the same sort of quality. So I think if you come across as it's almost too neat and too clean, if that makes sense to anybody. And Adrian Ramsey I mean, he lacks charisma almost entirely, and has alienated the left of his own party in various ways. Um, yeah, and what else is wrong with the Green Party? What the Green Party need to do is they need to grab hold of left populism and own that space politically. Um, I mean, look, I'm being a little bit harsh, right? So if you look at the polling, they have improved, nowhere near as much as Reform. They won seats in the local elections, um, but they're just not doing well enough. I mean, Labour should be hemorrhaging votes to their left because the attitude to the left from the Labour Party since they took on the leadership has been incredibly hostile. And being on the left, it feels like you're almost like a hostage when it comes to election time, because what the Labour Party want to say to you at one and the same time is, well, firstly, we hate you, and we think that your brand of politics is juvenile and irresponsible, and if you put it to the British public, it would get absolutely nowhere. You're totally unelectable. You're a sort of mob of angry protesters that aren't interested in power. All of this stuff, right? That's what they say about the left, and then they expect us to vote for them. I mean, it's a mad political strategy, isn't it? Like to basically go around insulting your electoral base, and then to say, "Ah, but you've got nowhere to go." Um, so that's where the Green Party could benefit, because obviously, if you're on the left, you don't. It's like I describe it as like being in a traumatic relationship. I'm in a traumatic relationship with the Labour Party. I want them to be better than they are, but they're not. And in fact, quite the opposite. The Labour Party have gone out of their way to destroy the left. And that is for the Labour Party, that's a little bit like cutting off your own leg. The Labour Party's, in order to do well in an election, Blair understood this. You need the left as part of your electoral coalition. If you're the Labour Party, you can't survive without it. And that I suspect that's partly what happened at the last election. That in fact, I'm sure it is, because Labour did worst in their in their strongest seats at the last election, and actually they hemorrhaged support in some places, didn't they, to independents? So Wes Streeting nearly lost his seat. Jess Phillips nearly lost her seat. Yeah, absolutely. Carla Denyer speaks to the public like a TV presenter. That's quite a good analogy. It's like what was it when I don't know how old everyone is. I'm 40. When I was growing up, it was like CITV. She talks to voters as if she's presenting on CITV. Is the sound okay on here, by the way? I don't know if I'm a bit loud. If I am, I can turn myself down a little bit. Um, she's better than Adrian Ramsey. I think the thing is Zach Polanski, who's not an MP, is much better presentationally. That's their deputy leader. There are leadership elections coming up in the Green Party, I understand. So that's who I'll be voting for when that happens. Zach Polanski. I think we need new leadership. Do you think because the Greens are so left wing that there is a pretty low cap? I'm not sure. No, I don't think so at all. I mean, I think that if you think about what the fundamental problems in our politics, I mean, look, I would say this because I'm on the left, right? But part of the problem is one of the biggest industries that we have in the UK is buy-to-let landlordism. And buy-to-let landlordism does not produce very much value. It does produce some. If you buy a house and you improve it and you rent it out, right, you're producing some value by improving the quality of the housing stock. But once you've done that, what you are doing is you're holding the housing stock to ransom as an asset in order for the housing to magically go up in value because you're restricting the supply, and in order to extract people's earned wages to go directly into your pocket. Now, if that's one of the biggest industries in the UK, what you're going to do is you're going to create a system, and this is what wealth inequality does in general. Wealth inequality means that you've got lots of wealthy people who are living off what used to be called in the 19th century unearned income. They're living off the labor of other people, and they're not they're not contributing towards the productivity of our society. So if you have growing inequality in a society, that's going to create problems for economic growth because because what you're doing is you're substituting unearned income for earned income. The other thing that it does, which I've talked about on the channel before, is if you've got lots of people, if you've got a small class of people with lots of financial resources, those financial resources suck the real resources of society towards their own private interests. So just down the road from me is a private school where they've built a massive theatre, they've built a swimming pool, they've built a leisure complex. That's all of that private money from those wealthy parents going into that school, sucking all of that labour and resources into building those resources, all of which cannot be used by the public. The job of the state is to stop that happening and to ensure that the resources of society exist for all of us and are used to produce public goods for everybody. Um, so my perspective is that left-wing populism has the capacity to be very popular because inequality is the most pressing problem facing our society, not just in general terms, but also in generational terms. It's not because of the way that our the way that housing has become a financialized asset. It's become totally unaffordable for young people, and young people are just waiting for their parents to die in order that they can, if they are lucky enough to have parents who have housing, in order that they can have a house to live, and that's causing all sorts of social problems. And Farage speaks about those things. Um, and there are people within the Conservative Party who speak about these things. I'm just trying to remember his name. Bima Falami, I think he might have lost his seat at the last election. I spoke to him personally and talked to him about this, and I said to him, "Look, if the Conservative Party are going to have any hope of recovering their support, they're going to have a story to tell about how young people are going to get on the housing ladder." So I don't necessarily think this is a left-right thing. Um, it's a huge issue that you had a class of people, the boomers, who benefited from a massive increase in asset prices, particularly housing, and you've now got generations who you can't afford to get on the housing ladder. Um, and there are other things as well. The loss of gold-plated pension schemes, final salary pension schemes that the boomers benefited from, and we no longer do. The erosion of working conditions because of the destruction of the trade union movement in the 1980s. All sorts of things that left populism could start to talk about, right? Um, yeah, reform are absolutely going to reform will be the biggest party of the next election. So there's absolutely every possibility that they will replace the Conservative Party. We haven't had a situation that's looked anything like this in British politics since Labour overtook the Liberal parties um, in the after the First World War. So I think it's absolutely possible. It doesn't happen very often, but it absolutely can happen in circumstances like this. There's no reason to believe that it won't happen just because we have a two-party system. Um, yes, first past the post tends to lead to a two-party system, but it takes time in circumstances like this for that two-party system to establish itself because we're not in one at the moment in the polling. So it's anybody's guess who those two parties will be, but I think one of them will be Reform, and well, I guess the other one might be Labour, but who knows? I mean, I don't want to predict anything at the moment. Yeah, so I think we will go back to a two-party system, but I think it'll take a while. And I think that I don't think it's clear to me that those two parties will be Labour and the Conservatives in the current circumstances. Um, I know that seems like a wild thing to say, but the current political moment is not like anything we've experienced before. So I think we just need to get rid of the idea that politics is going to return to normal because it isn't. And there's a lot of bad analysis that is just assuming that politics always returns to some sort of Archimedean point in the middle. It doesn't. Um, you do have rare moments where parties decline. The Liberal Party in the early 20th century would be an example of that, and I think it looks a hell of a lot like that's what's happening now. Um, Making state schools as good as private schools. You can't make state schools as good as private schools. There's too much money going into private schools. It's just, I mean, it's a nonsense. I know that people say that. I worked in a private school, worked in two different private schools for 11 years as a politics teacher. Um, Absolutely no way that the state could ever compete with the amount of money going into those schools. If you think about the big ones as well, they own a lot of land, um, and there's no reason why they should keep that land. It is it's incredibly wasteful of society's resources to allow what are essentially charitable organisations to monopolise land in this country. Eton College, vast amounts of land. Harrow School, vast amounts of land. Um, I'm very left wing. I would nationalise the big public schools immediately. And the reason why I would do that is because they are charities, so there'd be no compensation owed to anybody. So you'd just be able to bring all of those resources immediately into the public sector without having to compensate anyone. Same with the big universities as well. Oxford and Cambridge have vast amounts of land and resources that could be bought properly into the public domain. And this is again the sort of populism I'm talking about. Like, you might not like these ideas, but there's nobody in mainstream politics talking about anything radical like this, and the difference that it could make. You know, there are resources out there that the state could claim and use for the social good. It's just that the Labour Party don't want to do it because there would be winners and losers. But that's what left populism is about. Politics is about making choices. The right are more than happy to make some of those choices. If we let Farage in at the next election, will he go after the National Health Service? I don't know, but he wants to. Thatcher talked about it and backed away because she was a sensible politician. I suspect. Pardon me, I'm drinking lager, so it's making me hiccup. Thatcher thought about it and backed away, and I suspect Farage will do the same. Um, yeah, obviously, I think Reform will win. I mean, all of the polling is telling us at the moment that Reform are on track to win the next election. Obviously, a lot could change, but there's no reason to believe it will change. The Labour Party are incredibly unpopular, so something big would have to happen to resurrect Labour's fortunes, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Yeah, Bim's a nice guy. He's the sort of person that should have stood for the leadership to restore the Conservative Party, but he lost his seat, unfortunately. Unfortunately for him, I don't really care if Tories lose their seats. It's just because I've met him, so I feel a little bit bad for him. The private schools don't give out a lot of bursaries and scholarships. It's a lie that they tell. It's not true. Lots of the bursaries and scholarships are given to already wealthy people in order to encourage them to send their children to the school. Um, there are some exceptions to this, but a lot of these schools, the scholarships are very, very minimal. And sending your child to a private school is not an option that's available to the middle class. It costs. Just trying to think how much it would be now. It's certainly around about 30 to 40,000 pounds a year. It's just not available, and obviously boarding's a lot more. So there's an idea that out there that the sort of scrimping and saving middle classes are the people that are sending their kids to private school. It's just not true. It's incredibly wealthy people, and private schools shouldn't exist. It's not a choice that's available to everybody. It's an incredibly selfish choice. Because what it does is it uses your power and your wealth to redirect society's resources to helping your children at the expense of everybody else's children. That's what it does. Um, People don't like to think about it in those terms because they don't take personal responsibility for what they do with their own choices, but that is the reality. Yeah, I'm a little bit more left wing than I give across in my normal videos. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of people saying that as well. The reform could be the biggest party, but not a majority. Why? Why not a majority? I mean, I guess let's think it through. The argument for it would be that you think for some reason reform's vote is capped. I think that the experience of Boris Johnson in 2019, very similar sort of politician appealing to a very similar set of voters, shows that that is not the case. It is very possible that once people see, I think once people see what's happened at these elections, actually reform will take off even more than they already have. And unfortunately, I've not been wrong about this so far. I did a video on this 3 months ago when I said exactly the same, and we've now got the shock result. So, the reason I'm so confident is because I've been predicting this for a very long time. If you look at my old YouTube channel, I think 3 years ago I was talking about this, the risk of. There's me and a friend of mine. We had a YouTube channel. It wasn't very popular, but we were talking about the idea of socialism or barbarism, to quote from Rosa Luxemburg. And the idea is that when you're in difficult economic circumstances, as we are, that you face a choice between doing something radical leftist about society's problems that's actually going to make a difference, or you end up with barbarism. In other words, you end up with the right. And Luxemburg was writing in the Weimar period in Germany, so her prediction ended up being true. I'm not saying we're heading to fascism. I think there's a lot of nonsense spoken on the left about Farage. I don't think he's a fascist. I think he's a extreme Thatcherite. That's the accurate description of him. Um, yeah, actually, the Labour Party policy on private schools is not helping that sector. Unfortunately, the good special educational needs schools are private special educational needs schools. And so there are a lot of parents, because the state is not doing a very good job in that area, a lot of parents are forced to send their children to private special educational needs schools. So that's the one area where I might have a different view, but only because the state has neglected that sector. Um, so I think one of the things I would do is exempt special educational private schools from the VAT changes immediately. Yeah, the marginality of seats has gone up massively at the last election, and that is because um, Labour's support at the last election was very shallow. It was very much an anti-Tory vote. They lost support in their core seats, which a lot of people didn't notice, but they did. They fell back. So they only just won the seats that they won off the Tories, and they fell back in their so-called safe seats. So Labour doesn't have that many safe seats anymore. There's a reason why people don't drink on these streams. Because I watch these streams and I think, well, why don't people drink? And the reason is it makes you burp. So you're sort of constantly having to suppress that need as you go through. I'm oversharing, but there we go. Um, yeah, I mean, look, I'm not in favour. We can have this argument on the stream all day. I'm not in favour of private schools. I worked at a private school for 10 years, so you could say I'm a hypocrite. My students did, but I don't believe in private education. I think it's wrong. Um, and you can make every excuse under the sun for it, but within our current economic and political system, if you choose to send your children to private education, what you are doing is you are sending resources towards your own private ends at the expense of other people's children. It is not, it's not a cost-free exercise what you're doing. How about how about we just stop rich people existing by taxing them appropriately on their income and their wealth? Because that's what we used to do between 1945 and 1979. We used to have very high taxes on the wealthy, and we grew very, very fast in that period. It's a myth that high taxation is incompatible with high economic growth. That is what happened for the entirety of the post-war consensus up until the oil shocks of the 1980s. Um, yeah, I think that's perfectly possible. Idle's corner, unfortunately. Um, I mean, at the moment, the far right, however, are quite a small force within our politics. I know that there was that rioting, but actually it petered out quite quickly. I mean, it's big in some areas, isn't it? Um, they're massively outnumbered when ordinary people are mobilized against them. I'm basing my experience a little bit too much on living in Brighton, though. We had there was talk of the far right coming to Brighton during that period of time, and I sort of thought there's absolutely no way they'd be stupid enough to come to Brighton. And I was right because I think there was one person turned up, and there was maybe about 7,000 people turned out to the counter protest. So the police ended up having to protect this one guy on the far right. Homeschooling doesn't have the same damaging effect. No, the problem. I just want to be really clear about this. The problem is that if you put lots and lots of money into an enterprise like that, what do these schools do? They spend that money because they have to, because they're charities. That sucks resources towards building really expensive, lovely buildings for these children at the expense of the rest of society, because resources in society are limited. So if you're using resources to provide a swimming pool for a private school, you're not using those resources for everybody else. It is a zero-sum game. I think that's what people miss about inequality. It, there are only so many resources to go around. So if you choose to have an unequal society, the private affluence is going to rocket. You're going to have wealthy people benefiting, and everybody else will lose out. That is the problem with inequality. It damages the rest of us. I mean, age is still a very significant factor in voting behaviour. Um, I think if you look at the age demographics of what's happening here, you'll find that a lot of reform voters are older. Um, that will still be partly what's going on. I've not looked into that, but I'm pretty sure I'll be right about it if I did. What else do I want to say? I was enjoying that argument about private schools. What do other people think? Sort of, I never know what to do with the audience I have on here because it's actually quite diverse politically. Um, and usually when I express my true beliefs, I get like loads of people in the comments having a go at me. So that's why most of my videos are a little bit more moderate. Um, so Scott too, yeah. So what I'm saying is, so if you think about the UK economy, the UK economy is made up of a certain amount of labour, a certain amount of land, a certain amount of raw materials, capital equipment, and money decides where those resources go. So if those resources are being used to build new buildings in private schools, like swimming pools, those resources cannot also be used to build swimming pools for the public good. That's what I'm saying. So there's a fundamental problem there. In economics, it's called the fundamental economic problem. There are infinite wants and scarce resources. So if you have inequality, it means that society's resources are skewed towards satisfying the needs of the rich at the expense of everybody else. That's what I'm saying. It is true. Oh, I missed that. The problem is I've got a scrolling screen, so I missed some of the comments. I'm sorry. Somebody just made probably quite a good comment about rich people. Um, I would have Zach Polanski lead the Green Party is the answer. Um, if it was one of the two of them, it'd be Carla. But there are elections coming up in the Green Party, so neither of them would be my preferred choice. Yeah, I don't think the teaching is fundamentally better in private schools. I think that parents are paying to send their children to a school full of children from the same class as they are from. It's a fundamentally classist enterprise as well, and it is therefore morally repugnant to me. I can say all of this now because I no longer work for a private school. And when I did work for a private school, I unionized it and I won a 50% pay rise for a group of all women workers, which didn't make me very popular with the management. You can look it up in the Morning Star. Um, the SNP is really interesting because it's sort of faded into the background in our politics. The decline in Labour automatically helps the SNP, but that does not mean that there's suddenly going to be a surge in nationalism. And in addition to that, the Westminster parties will never give another vote on independence. I don't think. Well, the problem with labels like centre left is that the centre has moved so much since the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Somebody like Harold Macmillan would be considered centre left in today's politics. So the problem with living in an era that is defined ideologically by the consequences of Thatcherism is that um, you know it skews what we think of as the centre ground. There's no such thing as a centre ground really because of that problem. Why is it too difficult to tax assets rather than wages? Um, I think the reason that political parties are worried about it is because you'd actually be taking on the vested interests that run our society. And we know what happens when you do that because we've watched it happen to a certain Jeremy Corbyn. He was destroyed by the media and by the powerful interests in society because he dared dared to challenge them by putting forward a program that would actually meaningfully change the country. And you can see, this is part of the problem with Starmer. He's absolutely terrified of what the Times will write if he pivots to the left, because he understands that one of the constraints that applies to Labour leaders in particular is the press. And the reason that that constraint exists is because the press represent the interests of the powerful. Yeah, absolutely. The Overton window has moved massively to the right over the last 50 years, particularly economically. Socially, it's obviously moved to the left until quite recently. We're having a backlash, as we do from time to time. Yeah, I mean, I'm not a Keynesian. I mean, I am a Keynesian, but I'm not like my political analysis, my economic analysis is a bit more radical than Keynesianism. Corbyn's a lovely man, obviously. Um, he was monstered by the press for daring to challenge the status quo. I've got nothing against people who go to private schools, by the way, or people who work in them. As I say, I worked in a private school for 10 years. I just do not think that they should exist. Um, how do you tax intellectual property? Well, you could regulate intellectual property differently. So copyright laws are quite a modern invention, and they're sometimes quite bad things. Um, so I think you could move things into the commons more quickly than you currently do. So you could have a limited protection for intellectual property that lasts for a certain period of time, and probably limit it to fewer things as well. Um, if Tim Berners-Lee had decided to copyright the internet, we'd be living in a very different world. So there should be certain things that should not be copyrightable. I don't know a lot about copyright law, but I think that's my general view. Essentially, the more the thing is good for the rest of society, the less you should be able to copyright it. Especially because most of the innovations that we see in our society actually depend upon investment from the state. Um, the innovations that came out of the NASA program, for example, um, which Mariana Mazzucato talks about in her book. Yeah, and that's the other thing. Really good point, CJ. The other thing is, if you look at our political system, um, almost every prime minister went to one of Harrow, Eton, or Westminster, and it's not even close. In fact, I think a majority went to Eton. I mean, like the vast majority went to one school, which is obviously crazy because you can only afford to go there if you're ultra wealthy. How's everyone feeling about this result? I've gone through, the local election result. I mean, I've gone through a wave of emotions because actually part of me wanted to see the Labour right suffer for their hubris, and so I went through that. But now I'm feeling pretty bad, pretty worried. Yeah, that I said Eton. It's just that is my accent. I'm from the north of England. Don't feel too upset. Well, it hasn't happened yet, has it? These are like it's like the canary in the coal mine. Um, I mean, for me, the canary in the coal mine was years ago. I could see this coming a mile off with Starmer's leadership of the Labour Party and what he was doing to the left. Because the traditional analysis on the left about um, the traditional analysis from the left is that the left are the only real bulwark against fascism. They're the only reliable bulwark against fascism. And so if you destroy the left to the point where they are totally disempowered within a society, that creates a lot of danger for the right to sort of come to power. So I've been worried about this for a long time, and I remain worried about it. Yeah, so I mean, one thing that people don't know about me, Idle's Corner, that you wouldn't necessarily guess from how I'm speaking, is that I was a Thatcherite for most of my life. I was a Thatcherite until my 20s, late 20s. And what actually changed me was reading the political philosophy of John Rawls, but I won't go into that now. I was teaching political philosophy at the University of York, and the more I taught Rawls's political philosophy, the more I moved to the left. That was also during the austerity period when it became very evident that the left was right about austerity and that it was a false economy. Because if you make spending cuts to try and make short-term savings, what you're actually doing is you're storing up problems for the future by failing to invest. As we have seen, it's one of the big problems of the UK economy that we just don't invest enough. And the state could do that directly and should probably do more of that directly. And to be fair, Labour are doing a bit more of it. But the problem is that we've fallen so far behind on a lot of that. You only need to look at our sewers, our our railway lines compared to places like China. We've got barely any high speed rail. I voted for Conservative in 2005, Michael Howard. I was a member of the Conservative Party. I was a hardcore Thatcherite, and I was still pro-conservative in 2010. I first voted Labour in 2015, but I was on the right of the Labour Party. I remained on the right. Never voted for Jeremy Corbyn to be leader at any point. Always very critical of him. And it's only since Corbyn has left power that I've moved to the left, which makes me feel painfully stupid, to be honest. But it also makes me very tolerant of other people being painfully stupid sometimes. You have to study Rawls. Rawls is great. I've got a video about John Rawls if you're interested in knowing more about him. So just go on my channel and have a little look at that. It's one of the videos I'm most proud of actually, but nobody watches it. So if you could go and watch it, that'd be great, and you'd learn a lot. Essentially, Rawls's argument is that um, if we look at society in a way that forces us to be impartial, we would choose to care more about inequality. To summarize it in a very brief way, a 700-page book that's very sophisticated. Um, I think, yeah, there's an idea today, isn't there, that reform will suffer from actually having to run councils. I don't think people care about enough about local politics for that to be as damaging as people think it will be. I could be wrong about that. I think that, if I think locally, the Greens have been punished for perceptions that they ran the council where I am badly, so it can have a political impact, but it's not going to be widespread enough, I don't think, to really damage them as much as people are saying. Yeah. So what moved me to the left? I honestly don't know, but I think really it was just thinking about economics differently, and also understanding that a lot of the arguments against left wing policies were just they're often like pragmatic arguments, aren't they? So like I used to say to people, well, we could do that, but it's really difficult or it's impossible because if you tax the rich, they'll all leave, things like that. And then I started to think, well, that's not a very good argument, is it? Because it doesn't deal with the morality of the situation. If something's moral, then we should try and deal with the practicalities. Um, so for example, I think when I was first thinking about that, I thought, well, couldn't you just try and have an international agreement where everybody just agreed that they would tax the wealthy? That's a possible solution. And then the more I thought about it, I thought, well, actually, there's lots of other things that you could do. The Labour governments of the post-war period used capital controls to just stop people from taking wealth out of the country. You could have exit taxes. There's all sorts of policy measures that you could use to stop capital flight. You could tax things that are difficult to move, like land, which some people on the left propose. So the idea that you just practically can't do it, well, it's just not true. There are lots of different ways you could tax wealth if you wanted to. Um, if you've watched my video on a wealth tax, I'm in favour of a one-off wealth tax because it's very difficult for the wealthy to avoid that. Yeah, and I like Gary's economic analysis. I think he's a little bit long-winded, some of his analysis, but yeah, he's fundamentally right. Um, particularly about what Gary points to is the same sort of thing I'm trying to point to that because what Gary's argument is if you have not lots, if you've got a small minority of very, very wealthy people, some people say, well, fair dues to them, it's not affecting me or my life, but it is. That's what Gary's argument essentially is, because resources are finite. So if a small group of people have lots of them, the rest of us have less of them. So it's not all right. And there is a view, which I think I have, that having wealthy people in our society is actually not a good thing. It has worked though. Yeah, it has worked. Somebody's saying it's never worked, so we can't do it. And I know they're just putting that in quotation marks because it's what I've just said, but it worked in Britain for the post-war period up until the 1990s. Yeah, I might do a video about Ed Miliband. I don't know. I never know what I'm going. People ask me about what I'm going to do videos about. I don't know at any given time. I started a series about the 1990s for some reason, which I might continue. Um, it's basically down to what I'm interested in. The Prime Minister series is sort of hit the rocks a little bit because the further back I know, the less I know about the Prime Ministers. So, and then the more I put out a video that gets people in the comments correcting the odd tiny little mistake that I make, which annoys me. So I sort of Um, have a lovely night. What is the time? Oh, it's 10. It's 10 past 10. I won't stay on for much longer. How about I go and get one more beer and I drink that, and then I go to bed once I've finished that. I think that might be a good idea. I'm literally my kitchen's just there, so I'll be back in just a second. There we go. Is anybody else drinking? It's nice doing like this because then you feel like you're not just drinking in your house alone. Oh, I like the Madry. Yeah, I mean, the argument for banning billionaires is I mean, so obviously correct. I don't even know how anybody could defend it because billionaire wealth is problematic in other ways. So I haven't gone into some of the other arguments, but you've seen in American politics with people like Musk, they're also trying to use their wealth to buy democracy. So extreme wealth is incompatible with living in a very democratic system as well. It didn't really stop working in the 1970s. Um, we had stagflation in the 1970s, which was a relatively new economic phenomena, and it can't be dealt with very easily using Keynesian methods. So you have to move to a position where you use interest rates to control inflation, or at least that's the idea that caught on. So that's the sort of current consensus that you have independent central banks who control interest rates. I'm not sure how keen I am on it, to be honest, because it's not neutral politically. If you institutionalize the idea that inflation always matters more than unemployment, which essentially you do with a central bank that has to hit an inflation target, then that means that you have a situation where, and I think we went through a situation like this recently. We were in the middle of a cost of living crisis, and the Bank of England were putting up interest rates, which was hurting people's mortgages. Now, that's not a very good choice politically, but if you've got an independent central bank, that's what they're going to do. And because I thought that the inflation was largely supply side, I wasn't convinced that it was necessary to increase interest rates. I work at a trade union now. Yeah, I hate the fact that it's a really good example. Yeah, that you've got that only ultra rich people can go into space. I mean, how wasteful is that? That's a really good example of what I'm talking about. If you've got ultra wealthy people, then vast amounts of society's resources are going into sending them up into space. Those resources, therefore, cannot be used for building schools. That's the choice we've got to make as a society. And if you put up with extreme inequality, that is the choice you're making. They don't earn the money. You can't earn billions of pounds. It's not possible. So the word earn does not apply to billionaires. You cannot earn billions of pounds. It's just logically impossible. If you think about the word earn is a moral concept, right? What billionaires actually do is they make money because lots of people in a collaborative enterprise called a business work together to produce wealth. And then they, because they own the business, extract most of that wealth rather than paying their employees what they deserve. Yeah, I like the election videos. I mean, this whole channel started because I was in lockdown and so I thought, oh, I'll make some videos for my students about elections. Absolutely. Hypercapitalism is a disaster for ordinary people, because it also pulls the rug from underneath the feet of the working class. The more power and wealth you give to the billionaire class, the less you're able to get it back again. Democracy is the biggest weapon that we have, and that's why democracy is so flawed. It's why the political class don't want to give us proportional representation in this country, because it's too powerful a weapon. Um, the original demand of the Chartists, by the way, was for annual elections, annual parliaments. They asked for, amongst other things, and you can see why they asked for it in the current circumstances. If we had annual parliaments, the Labour Party would be facing removal from office this year, which is what should happen. I know it's the easiest word to use, but it's also a moral concept, right? And the reason to tax at 100% once you get past a certain level of income is because society should collectively decide that it's morally impermissible for people to earn more than a certain amount of money. Not a very popular idea these days. But that is what we used to do. That's why marginal tax rates in the 1970s were upwards of 98%, because we collectively decided that we did not believe it was right for some people to earn masses more than other people. And that was the right decision, because since we got rid of all of that, inequality has increased massively, both in terms of income inequality and in terms of wealth inequality. And both of those things are bad for society. If you look, I mean, just to add some more evidence for this, if you read the book The Spirit Level, the authors of The Spirit Level found that increasing wealth of a society, economic growth, in other words, once you get to a certain level of economic growth, it did not provide any additional benefit, whereas more equal societies performed better on every metric they looked at, pretty much, compared to less equal societies. And the same applied in US states. So more equal states did better on a range of metrics than less equal states. So it is just good for society to have less inequality. We know that. It's a fact that can be proved with data. The dynamics of why that is kind of irrelevant. We know that if we make our society more equal, then lots of things will go better. Unfortunately, lots of people have an interest in ensuring that that doesn't happen, and um, that's why the arguments that are being put to me exist, right? Because you have, part of the reason people believe these arguments is because billionaires also put their money into think tanks. And so when the BBC has a debate about wealth and taxation, there'll be someone there from the Adam Smith Institute who's bought and paid for by the wealthy. Um, the union movement has some resources. So we have some resources to do the opposite, but nowhere near as much. The trade union movement, as we know, was smashed in the 1980s intentionally by a government that knew and understood its class interest. Yeah, I'm glad my video is useful, Jacob. Is that for your A-level politics, A-level history? What's my most right-wing opinion? What is my most right-wing opinion? I don't actually know. I'll think about it. It might come up in the discussion. I don't know. Blair wasn't a social democrat. He was more right-wing than that. He was a third-way socialist. Because he social democrats believe in equality as an outcome, but they believe that you need to get there through rather than through the politics of ownership. They want to get there through the politics of distribution, so taxation, for example, investing in public services. Blair did not believe in reducing inequality through taxation, really. He reduced child poverty and pensioner poverty, mostly because of the policies of Gordon Brown. So he used the state to reduce poverty, but inequality did not fall under Blair. So if he was a social democrat, he wasn't a very good one. Farage supports nationalisation because he knows it's popular. It's also like, let's think about this from a Thatcherite point of view, right? The Thatcherite argument is that um, industries should be privatized because it creates competition and that creates innovations and it means that the industries do better. There are certain industries where that's not possible because they're natural monopolies. So railways is an example, water is an example, energy is an example of all of that. So there are certain industries that even people on the right should want to nationalize because it makes no sense to hand over natural monopolies to private interests. And then you have, I suppose, a different sort of argument for something like steel. The argument for steel would be that if you leave it up to the free market, that a strategic industry will leave the United Kingdom. So you could have a kind of nationalist argument for nationalising on the right to say, well, we want Britain to have a steel industry because it's a strategic resource that we don't want leaving the country and we don't want to be reliant on China for it. So you don't necessarily have to have left-wing reasons to nationalise. Yeah, A-level politics can be very good, but if you've got a bad politics teacher, it can be very dry. I bet your politics teacher says that the only way that you win elections is by moving to the centre ground. Not true. Can be true. It's an interesting theory. My videos are an antidote to the typical way that teachers teach these things, I think. I'm glad you're enjoying A-level politics. I hope you do it at university. It's a great subject to study. You're going to do well at it. I mean, if you're staying up to watch my videos on YouTube, then you're going to do well at level politics. Have you got any questions about politics generally that I can answer? Yeah, I mean exactly. So a lot of what private interest does is it takes things that have been developed using public money and commercializes them. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Um, the best argument, by the way, here's a right wing opinion. Okay, this might be my most right wing opinion. I don't know if I believe it or not. There is one argument that works for inequality, which is that innovation depends upon the wealthy. Because if you take any emergent technology, this is the argument, it always starts out by being something that only the wealthy have. So the mobile phone's a nice example. Yeah, starts off as the car phone. Only very wealthy business people have it. Then it develops into the big bricks that you see in the 1980s. Again, only the wealthy have them. And then it becomes a mass consumer product in the 90s. 1945. But the centre ground moves, right? So it's like, I mean, you could just say, well, yeah, 1945, they were in the centre ground by definition because that's what people voted for. It's like, it's a stupid argument because the centre is not static. So, um, you know, Thatcher didn't win the election in '79 from the centre ground. She was clearly on the right of politics. Um, she was putting forward a very radical program. The neoliberals, as a group, which is what she was seen as absolute cranks throughout the 20th century, and yet it became and now is mainstream economic thought. It's wrong, but it's mainstream economic thought because Thatcher won the political battle. And it doesn't matter that there's, I mean, because the argument that's put forward is that the reason that you win the election is because you've moved to the centre. It's a causational claim. So it's simply demonstrating that that politicians tend to win from the centre ground doesn't prove that that's a causal statement. So if you watch all of my videos that I've done about every election, what you'll find is that there's always a better explanation for every election. If you think about elections as being unique historical events that exist within a social and economic framework, there's always a much better explanation. So Blair would have done better in '97, for example, in my view, if he'd moved to the left a little bit, because that was popular at the time. There's really good polling evidence on this. And Starmer would have done better in 2024. Similarly, he was far too cautious. But we can't know that, can we? You know, there's good evidence for it, though. The Ming, look at what the Ming Vase strategy has done for Starmer. It's left him without a stable base of support in the country. I'm not sure about smartphones. I guess that's right. I don't think it's as right as like. I'm trying to think what the new version of that is. Like what's the technology only that? Oh, Tesla cars, I suppose. Self-driving Tesla cars. Has anybody watched the YouTube videos of that in America where they can just press the button and it just drives itself? I mean, this is the other problem with the centre ground argument. It's only ever applied to Labour. And what it really means is Labour only win elections when they don't scare the right wing press. That's what it really means. That's the reason Labour don't win when they're not on the centre ground, because the right wing press monster anybody that tries to attack their interests. Jeremy Corbyn almost won in 2017, but the interests of the right wing press stopped that from happening. They've not yet won, Oliver, and they may not win. Politics is very difficult to predict. There's no reason to think that Labour will recover. If you were making that argument, so I reckon there's people around Starmer right now saying, look, we just got to stick with the strategy. As soon as people start to benefit from our policies with economic growth, we'll see a turnaround. The problem with that is Labour do not have a plan for growth. And we're entering a very unstable period for the world in terms of economic growth. So it's unlikely that the growth fairy is going to come down and rescue them. And they don't have a plan B as things stand. So there's no reason to believe that there'll be a recovery. Now, you could argue the opposite then. You could say, well, maybe there's reason to believe that reform will mess up, which is what people have been saying today, by running local councils. It's possible. Our argument only works if you think that we're blessed with very, very competent local councillors as things stand. And that argument only works if you've never met a local councillor. I'm not convinced by it. I'm going to be upsetting all of the local councillors who are watching the video now. But yeah, I mean, Reform are actually right about some of the things they say about local councils. They're incredibly badly run. Yeah, absolutely, CJ. Yeah. So my position on elections is simply to look at every election and understand what was going on at that point in history to explain what happened. There's no other way of doing it. To try and apply a general rule to politics is very stupid. It's what political scientists do, and they are mistaken. Politics is an art, it's not a science. I don't think so. I think Reform are right wing in every sense, really. The arguments that Farage uses for stuff are right wing in nature. His instincts are right wing. His ideology is right wing. There are some left-wing policies, incidentally, but I think you can explain them from the right, as I just did with the nationalisation policy. Yeah, exactly. Another good point. Yeah. So if you're living in an unequal society, it's not growth that matters; it's the distribution of that growth. So, and also, it's important to understand what we mean by growth, right? So if we're getting growth because financialized assets are going up in value, or if we're getting growth because more people are becoming buy-to-let landlords, then you're having a growth of unearned income, and that's not increasing the productive capacity of the economy, really. I don't know if that point made sense. Made sense in my head. Yeah, you can't turn back time. What Trump needs to be doing is understanding that the industries he wants to create for the working class are the industries of the future. But Trump is not really interested in his base in that sense. He's another multi-millionaire. So his real agenda is to look after people in his own class. Yeah, absolutely. We agree about that, Oliver. Trends do exist, but rules of politics don't exist. And it's not a good way of doing political analysis to believe that they do. Otherwise, you make all sorts of mistakes and things take you by surprise. And that's what's happening at the moment with a lot of the mainstream analysis of politics. There's lots of surprise that the two-party system's broken down because people thought that the two-party system was some immutable law of politics. It's not. Um, Look at the 1993 Canadian election and see what happened to the Conservative Party over there. They were obliterated, never to exist again. So it's not, there's no immutable law that says that Labour and the Conservative Party have to survive. The Conservative Party are the most successful party in the history of politics because they endlessly adapted and changed to changing circumstances very skillfully. The Labour Party have existed for just over a century. They've been pretty successful. But in my view, they haven't fulfilled their fundamental purpose, and the party has been taken over by the middle classes. So the working class no longer have a party that represents their interests. I think that's a problem. And that again is creating space for reform, right? They can cosplay as a sort of working class party because no party exists for ordinary people. Reform is electable right now, I think, um, by default. Um, because what you have to do to win an election under first past the post is not be popular. It is cobble together an electoral coalition that can get you the most votes in enough seats. And when you have a electoral system or a situation like you do now, where there are five parties that have got significant amounts of support, you only need to get to about 30%. So that makes politics very volatile. You've also got a decline in partisan attachment to parties and party attachment. Um, but I think the big thing that's driving politics really is apathy. You're talking too much. People are justifiably apathetic and annoyed about politics because politics is not working for them. So they're therefore reaching for the only possible alternative. I think immigration is a problem for the left. Yeah, I mean, any issue could be a problem for the left if the right wing press turn it into a huge problem and create a narrative around it that's unhelpful, which I think is what's happened with the small boats, for example. because there's two ways of framing that, right? So you could frame it in terms of what it's doing to us, or you could frame it in terms of what it's doing to them. What you have is lots of desperate people risking their lives to get to the United Kingdom, some of whom are dying. That's a story. And even the way the story is framed dehumanizes those people. It's the small boats crisis. Stop the boats. There's nothing about the humanity of the people that's mentioned in these discourses. So I think it's a problem for the left, yeah, because it's framed in a dehumanizing way. And as soon as people are reminded that there are human beings involved, like when the front of the Daily Mail had to cover a small child washing up on the shore of Greece, people do momentarily respond differently. I mean, there's a left-wing way of responding to this stuff as well. The reason why there's lots of people having to be housed in hotels is because Thatcher eviscerated the council housing stock, so we've got nowhere else to put them. If we had council housing, which we would if we'd had a consistently left-wing government over the years, then we'd be able to house people, including migrants. No, there isn't any party that's worth voting for. I mean, I'm a member of the Green Party, but I don't even like the Green Party that much. I'm not very party political. I'll vote for a party if they deserve my vote. The Green Party, I mean, they're the best that there is, I suppose, for somebody in my position, but I'm not enthusiastic about them. The local elections were not just a process vote, they fully reflected national polling. How do the left leave the shackles of the press? Well, the press are becoming a bit less influential, now. So the rise of new media and the decline of legacy media might help over time. I think really what the left need, what I mean, my strategy politically, if you want to hear it, is to put the same manifesto before the public every single time until they eventually say yes. Because my view is most of the time the winner is whichever party benefits from the other party messing things up. So if you just keep going back and saying, "Are you sure?" rather than constantly watering down what you actually believe in to try and get into power. So I taught in a private school, Andrew. So the funding cuts did not affect me when I was a teacher. I now work for a trade union, so I can't comment on that, unfortunately. My students were very well engaged, lovely people, but I still don't think private schools should exist. They are utterly useless, yeah. The Green Party are utterly useless, yet I remain a member. Yeah, Reeves is terrible. I mean, she's the embodiment of what is wrong with politics. She speaks in a robotic manner. It's all cliches. She doesn't present a convincing narrative, a political argument. No, I don't believe in capitalism fundamentally. I believe in markets. So you might be thinking, well, what's the difference? We need to have markets in order to govern exchanges between free individuals. But the existence of markets does not equal capitalism, in my view. Some people on the left would disagree. I'm a market socialist, so I believe in giving democratic and economic ownership and control of businesses to working people directly to manage um, within a market structure. So yeah, I believe in abolishing capitalism. Yes, gradually. I don't think you could do it. I don't think you could do it. But you probably can't. I mean, the problem with what I believe is you probably can't do it democratically because uh, the evolving into a system that is not capitalist will come across too much resistance. But I don't believe it's moral to do it any other way, I suppose. Yeah, absolutely. What we should do, yeah, we should keep putting the same manifesto forward until. Had we put the 2017 manifesto to the British public in 2024, not only would Labour have won, they would have won a bigger majority, in my view. Can't prove it. Labour only won because the Tories fell apart in 2024. It's almost always the case. The Tories came to power in 2010, not because they were particularly popular. Cameron was never popular. He didn't win a majority. The popularity of the Conservative Party improves after that point, but when he's elected, he's not that popular. He wins the election because of the financial crisis. And the narrative that he's able to tell, I suppose, after that crisis as well is important. Yeah, I might. I would stand as a councillor, maybe an MP, if I was asked to. Um, I wouldn't win though, probably. I mean, maybe in these circumstances I would. I don't know. Like, Christ knows what will happen in the next election. I mean, there's no guarantees, is there, that if you stand for one of the big parties, you're going to get in. Some random independent could win a seat. Definitely, the next election there'll be enough of that going on. It's more likely. Global conflict's always more likely in a multipolar world compared to a unipolar world. It's even more likely in a bipolar world. So I worry about conflict. Yes, it's more likely now than it has been in recent times. I don't know what the flashpoint is, but I'm fundamentally quite pacifist in my views and quite isolationist as well. So I think Britain should have regional interests, and it shouldn't concern itself with what happens halfway around the world, because we are at best a middle-ranking power. So we should be interested in Europe, and probably less interested than other European powers because we're on the edge of Europe, surrounded by friendly states and with a body of water between us and conflict. So I think strategically it would be better if Britain was less aggressive in its foreign policy stance in general. It's not a very popular view, that, but it is my view, and that hasn't changed because of the war in Ukraine. I think there's a real risk in Ukraine, actually, that continuing to fund Ukraine is going to be exacerbating a conflict that is needlessly costing lots of lives, when we know for a fact that it's going to inevitably have to end in a compromised position of some sort. So it's maybe that's my most right-wing opinion, because I basically agree with Trump on that, don't I? There we go. Somebody asked me earlier. Yeah, 2017. I mean, the thing that people forget about 2017 is it was a compromise manifesto. It wasn't as radical as what Labour put forward in 2019. And the key thing that it did was to commit to Brexit, and that allowed Labour to talk about other issues. So it was critical that they did that. And you can tell lots of stories about that election. There's lots of things that went on. The Tories ran a terrible campaign. However, if there was a natural cap on the amount of support that left-wing politics can receive, 2017 demonstrated that that is not that credible, because Corbyn secured a percentage of the vote that in ordinary circumstances would lead to a overwhelming majority. He was just unlucky that politics returned in that election to two-party politics in a big way. Between them, the two major parties got over 80% of the vote in 2017, which was unusual. I mean, look at what's going to happen in the next election. It's not going to be anything like that, is it? Well, I'm negative about the Green Party because they should be doing better in the current circumstances. Their job in politics at the moment is to push the Labour Party to the left by being a credible threat to the Labour Party on the left. And yes, they are a little bit, but Labour are far more threatened by reform at the moment, and that's likely to push them to the right based upon how the Labour Party think about these things. And that means the Green Party are not doing their job. Yeah, I mean, on Ukraine, geopolitics is not about morality. We don't get to decide who gets to win morally. We're not the world's policeman. There was a conflict, there was a baddie and there was a goodie. Yeah, whatever. Like, that's just not how geopolitics works. Unfortunately, the powerful do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. That's how geopolitics works. Unless we want to be endlessly involving ourselves in conflict. So we need to have a strong foreign policy position to deter countries from going to war with us, but we don't want to be involved in conflicts. We don't want to exacerbate conflicts that are going on. And if we think about our strategic interests as Britain, we are not as strategically interested in Ukraine as countries that are closer to that conflict. So we shouldn't be leading on it as we have been. There was a rumor that, or there was a story, I think it was in the Times, that Boris Johnson, that there was a deal on the table, and Boris Johnson encouraged Ukraine to fight on, which is morally unforgivable if that was true. Everybody's a pacifist, Oliver, when it comes to it. Nobody wants war. Nobody wants war. And if we're honest, our concerns are all quite parochial. It's the children of the working class that are sent off to conflicts across the world at the behest of right-wing politicians. So yeah, I'm a pacifist because I don't believe in engaging in that hypocrisy. I wouldn't be willing to fight in a war, so I don't believe in sending the poor over to fight on my behalf when I'm too much of a coward to do it myself. Yeah, they do sound like a good group, and No Justice MTG is a great YouTube streamer. If you don't subscribe to her, she's worth subscribing to, particularly if you're on the left. Yeah, so I'm expressing, Oliver, a very realist foreign policy stance, which is quite unusual for somebody on the left, actually. I think Britain needs to think more about its strategic interest. Um, and yeah, and part of the problem with the so-called special relationship is that in practice, it's meant that Britain hasn't had its own interest. It's been dragged into wars because it's sought to maintain a special relationship that hasn't been working for Britain. It's been dragging us into international conflicts that have not been in our interest for years. And we're now tied into the US military industrial complex in a really bad way, which means we can't have an independent foreign policy or even an independent nuclear policy. What about World War II? Yeah, it was right that we thought that sometimes you're forced into conflict. Um, but appeasement was not necessarily a bad policy in World War II. We needed to buy time to rearm. Yeah, it'd be crazy to allow Ukraine to be part of NATO. It would be incredibly antagonistic, um, and would be more likely to create conflict with Russia, which we want to avoid, obviously. You cannot have a NATO country on the border with Russia that they, because of their ethno-nationalism, that they want to invade. I think that's it. That's likely to cause a massive conflict. that we don't want to be involved in, and we shouldn't bluff with these things. Like, we are not willing to go to war with Russia over Ukraine. That's been proven by what's happened. Russia knows this now. So getting Ukraine to sign a piece of paper that says that we would when we wouldn't is not a very sensible thing to do. And it also antagonizes them unnecessarily. This is realism. I mean, it feels horrible to say these words, but you have to have some reality about this. Anyway, geopolitics is not my area, as is clear. Yeah, Finland is a NATO member. Yeah. I mean, ideally, if we think about the West's interests, there needs to be a buffer state between us and Russia. Yeah, it's okay. There's going to be lots of disagreement about this, and I'm not going to like be as I'm not going to be banging my fist on the table about it because I'm not. Um, Geopolitics is not my expertise at all. So, um, and I'm not saying that I'm not commenting on the cause of the conflict, except to say that the conflict didn't start recently. It's a long-standing conflict. It's been going on for a long time. That Russia escalated massively, and yeah, my view is that we should try and end that conflict as soon as possible. And I know that people would disagree about that, and that's fine. Yeah, I don't think they do, Oliver. I mean, if you think about I said I wasn't going to get sucked into this, right? But Russia has learned from this conflict that they have failed in their strategic objectives, like totally. Russia thought that it would be an easy conflict, that it would be like Blitzkrieg in World War II, that they'd just roll over Ukraine. And instead, they've been involved in a protracted conflict where yes, they're holding a lot of territory, but at huge cost, politically, economically, militarily. They're not going to be keen to start another conflict. This is not World War II. Not everything is World War II. It's like the only analogy the British people have is World War II. Not everything is World War II. World War II, again, unique historical situations. Yeah, you've got to analyze things as they are, not use spurious analogies from the past. George Galloway is a horrendous person and is not on the left. He has blocked me on Twitter. We're not good friends. He has very right-wing opinions about social policy. He's a charlatan in my view. But I don't know what he's been saying recently because he's blocked me on Twitter, so I've got no idea. It's almost like George Galloway doesn't exist and hasn't existed for the last 15 years for me. Yeah, but there's no way we would have been allies with Russia in World War II because we were a capitalist nation. I mean, at the outset, we only did it because of what Hitler did. I really want to get off foreign policy, but the comments are dragging me back. Yeah, Galloway blocked me because I kept mentioning the allegation that was made by Christopher Hitchens that he took oil money from Saddam Hussein, which may or may not be true. I actually think it might be false now. I think I was making libelous statements for which I apologise, but he did block me. So there was an allegation that he was receiving oil money from Saddam Hussein. I believe that not to be the case. And I apologize to George for making those comments, but as a result of that, he blocked me on Twitter. I'm also blocked by my local MP because I described it as a democratic outrage on Twitter that he had replaced a very good left-wing MP who was deselected right before the election because a spurious disciplinary matter suddenly occurred just in time for one of Keir Starmer's closest allies to be parachuted into the seat in Brighton Kemp Town. A lot of that went on in the last election. The Labour Party or the Labour right are not good friends of democracy. Yeah, I'm not a fan of Galloway. I just believe that he is a total charlatan. I may be wrong about that. I don't know. That's just how I feel about him. He's also he's not a consistent ally of minorities. His party is actively hostile to trans people, and I believe that the left should be consistently allying themselves to people that are under attack from the right-wing press and from right-wing interests in our society, however unpopular that is. No, I don't like Gaddafi. Why would I like Gaddafi? I generally don't like dictators because I believe in democracy. Yeah, I thought he would go to America. Yeah, Rishi Sunak. Um, right, what's the time? It's coming up to 11. I think I should end the stream now. So it's been delightful. This I was really nervous about doing this. Um, I'm a little bit concerned about some of the things I've said. Not sure I'm going to keep this video up, but I might do. No, Parliament is democratic as an organisation, but Parliament itself is not very democratic, is it? Because the electoral system is trash. Anyway, I'm going to go before I get dragged back into the comments. So it's been lovely spending time with you tonight. If you're not subscribed, I think most of you are, but if you're not subscribed, to subscribe to the channel. I've got a new video coming out tomorrow on 1991. I don't know why I'm doing videos about different years in politics, but I am. All right. So